Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our first GCHU Public Seminar of Trinity Term. It's really lovely to see all of you here today, especially on such a beautiful summery evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Astrid Krisch. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Global Center on Healthcare and Urbanization here at Kellogg College. And this seminar is part of the GCHU Public Seminars series, which runs twice a term in week 1 and in week 8. And it brings together researchers, policymakers, practitioners, and the community to explore themes at the intersection of urban sustainability, health, and well-being. And each session centers around a key question. We invite 4 speakers to offer a 5-minute response, which will then open up for a wider conversation with all of you. So please think about questions for the end. They are really what brings these events to life. So tonight we're hearing more about the urgent issue of how to solve the housing crisis without sacrificing our environment. And I'm really delighted to introduce Deborah Glass-Wooden, board member at the Oxfordshire Community Land Trust, who will be chairing this evening's conversation. So a huge thanks to OCLT for organizing the event and to our brilliant speakers for making this event possible. So without further ado, Deborah, over to you.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We're here to think collectively, and that's quite an important word, about how we can solve the housing crisis without sacrificing the planet. If you live somewhere like Oxford, a university city in the southeast of England, you may find yourself lucky or unfortunate enough to be grappling with some of the big challenges of our day every day. 2 of them, how we ensure that everyone is securely housed, but without compromising the home, planet Earth, that we all depend on, we will be addressing this evening. Central to this challenge, of course, is the finite nature of this most precious resource, land. How we manage and how we share it in the face of the competing demands, both for the resources it contains and consists of, and also the opportunities it offers to provide us with food, with homes, with floodplain, with energy, with nature, with open spaces, with recreation. Community land trusts exist to enable communities to take ownership of land and other assets. Beloved community buildings, open spaces for food growing, housing, to name but a few. Because once owned by the community, they're protected in perpetuity for the needs of the community. CLTs are purpose-driven and democratically run. They're run by the communities for the community. So this long-term perspective, but with an additional eye to local need, is why countrywide CLTs are developing permanently and genuinely affordable homes for local people, at the same time that the quantity of social housing is declining significantly. Oxfordshire Community Land Trust recently created 9 such homes for local people, and we have more in the pipeline. It's this long-term local need perspective that makes CLT so well placed to address one of the other critical issues of our time: how we restore, maintain, and enhance the health of our natural environment, which in turn is so critically important for the well-being of all of us. Here are some interesting statistics before I introduce our speakers, which kind of show us the scale of the problem. As of late 2024, there are almost 4,500 households on the waiting list for social housing in Oxford, and those often don't include key workers, the people that keep the city running, that cannot afford to live here. Within the city, the average house price is 12 times the average household earnings. To put this in context, the equivalent figure for England is 8.3. The average rent for a one-bed property in Oxford. Sorry, can people hear me? Because it feels like my mic's going on and off, but I ain't fiddling with anything. The average rent for a one-bed property in Oxford rose by 10.7% over the last year. 25% of total UK carbon emissions are attributable to the built environment. 25%. 50% of raw materials extracted globally are extracted for the construction sector. And 500 million tonnes of waste, the equivalent to a third of all of Europe's waste, are accounted for by products made from cement, i.e. buildings. With all that at the back of your minds, I'd like to introduce our panellists who are going to share their perspective on how we solve the housing crisis without sacrificing the planet. We're first going to hear from Abby O'Connor, who's an urban sociologist working as a researcher at the New Economics Foundation and a research fellow at the University of Liverpool. Excuse me. Daryl Chen is urban design lead at Hawkins Brown, who are master planning the new Begbrook Innovation District in Oxford. Third will be Tim Crabtree, co-founder and director of Wessex Community Assets. And finally, Becky Tunstall, Professor Emerita of Housing Policy at the University of York and visiting professor at LSE. So, as you heard earlier, they'll each have 5 minutes and then we'll open the floor to questions. Over to you, Abby. Yeah,
Hello.
well done.
Perfect, thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. So Josh asked me to talk through a bit of where we are at and how we got here, which of course in the context of the housing crisis is incredibly easy to do in 5 minutes. So please bear with me while we have a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I think for me to start off with, this keeps going on.
Yeah,
Hello? Is it me?
No, you're fine.
How about that? Perfect. Nothing like a tech problem. So I think for me, when I think about the housing crisis, which I do in my day-to-day work as both a researcher, an urban sociologist, and I'm a housing activist, and I've founded an activist group in the Northwest where we fight for housing justice every day, and we're facing incredibly significant problems, particularly in Liverpool city centre and wider in the Northwest, much like we are in all cities, as we've heard. I think for me, the big question is, in this country around land and housing, is what is it that we value? You know, do we value public good, common land, space, and thriving communities, or do we value private profit extraction and people living in homes that make them incredibly sick and they make our planet sick? And what we've seen, you know, over the past 4 decades and increasingly with consecutive governments, both blue and red, is that they are prioritising the latter. We're looking at short-termist, profit-driven, piecemeal reforms. If we're seeing any intervention that are built on the back of an incredibly extractive development model that places private profit over the goods of communities, simultaneous to the fact that we've been hemorrhaging public housing stock, of course, for the last 40 years. And I just think, as Deborah mentioned there, you know, the housing crisis is a land crisis fundamentally, and I think particularly in housing studies, you know, when I have conversations with sociologists, and I work a lot with, you know, friends, comrades, colleagues in the States and in Greece and other places, we often talk about where the land question is in the housing debate and how that's missed, and particularly that's around the cost. We talk about the cost of housing and the cost of rent, which is of course essential, it's eye-watering, but actually we need to also look at how land has continuously been used as a vehicle for profit. You know, the value of land's increased over 450% since 1995. It now represents over 50% of the UK's total net worth. but we know how few people actually own assets in terms of land and housing. And that's quite astonishing when you think about the fact that land is finite, and we've seen the fact that local authorities have been forced to sell off, or in the context of, I'll talk about Liverpool because it's my space, give away land for free under austerity because the local authority are told they can't hold that land anymore because there's no money for it. And so that land, of course, lands in public hands, and what we see being built on that space is private housing, not the social and community-led homes that we need. Of course, you know, it's of no news to anyone in this room, I'm sure, that the right to buy and the failure to end it has been chronic in this situation. And I know that's often a difficult conversation to have. I'll hold my hands up. My nan benefited from the right to buy, and if she was still here now, she'd probably be shouting at me for talking about it in such a negative way. But over 40% of the houses we've lost through the right to buy are now owned by private landlords that are rented out for profit on the market. And I think often when we talk about the right to buy, we think that it's, you know, often policy conversations that I have with civil servants and people is around, you know, it's not as much of a problem as it once was. We've lost over 100,000 social homes since 2015 alone. When we think about how many people are on the waiting list, that's an astonishing figure. And of course, what are we told? How do we get out of this? Well, we're told there's no money. And there's a lot of it. It's just going to the wrong places. Over the next 5 years, we've just done some research recently that shows that we're going to be subsidising private landlords £70 billion over the next 5 years in local housing allowance. Now, of course, that's not to say that people shouldn't get local housing allowance. That's to say that the perpetual raising of rents is seeing public money being funneled into private pockets. I mean, today, colleagues at Shelter have just come out with research that shows that by 2029, we're going to be spending £3.9 billion a year on temporary accommodation. That's poor quality accommodation. I've seen the insides of that accommodation. I'm sure many of you here have. You know, over 200,000 children will be living in temporary accommodation in a couple of years. And that's bankrupting councils. And we need to see the housing crisis as simultaneously a land crisis, but also a local government crisis. And I think just if I may talk about social housing briefly, because I know we're going to have a rich conversation about community. It's not just a moral argument anymore. There's an economic case for social housing. We know that. We've proved it time and time again. The government are refusing to listen, but we know that if we had 90,000 new social homes a year, that would be £50 billion injected into our economy. And of course, if you're not paying 60% of your wage on rent, you're probably going to have a bit more cash to spend in the local economy, of course. And you're going to have security in a different way. And I've seen people that have lived in temporary accommodation for years in private accommodation and moved into social housing, and it's life-changing for them. It's of course become, you know, over years stigmatized and somewhat of a folk devil, but you know, in my utopia, anyone that wants to live in social housing can and should. Of course, we're talking about the climate now, and I'm sure we'll come on to talking about building, but I just wanted to talk through a few policies that we've been working on at NEF around the fact that there are there are things that we can do that won't necessarily decimate our carbon footprint overnight. There are up to 1 million empty and second homes in this country. We could bring them back into public use. That would be quite a relatively quick fix relative to building homes. I mean, when I walked down my street today on the way to the train station, there was 3 houses alone there. And I know a lot of the argument is, well, they're not always in the right place. And you know, that's not perfect. And it's true. But there is aspects of that will make a huge difference. And I guess just because I've not got much longer, one other aspect that maybe we can talk more about is about how we resource local authorities to hold better standards in accommodation. Mouldy, cold, damp homes are not only killing people. I work on an estate in Maltby in Rotherham, and every single person on that estate has been in hospital because of respiratory problems, and their landlord's a millionaire who is not held to account on this. And if we had local authorities that were able to enforce issues around standards, that would have a massive impact on our climate footprint, right? In terms of heating, insulation, all of those aspects. These are things that we can and should do. And we're, of course, pushing the government to work on that. I'm going to stop there because I've got lots of other things on diversifying house building, but I will end there.
All right, you've got a big book of notes there. We're going to work our way through those. I am a simple man. I'm going to give you 3 simple messages. That is my contribution to this evening and a very complicated topic. The first is that we need to diversify who builds And I think if we do that, it does actually strike to the heart of not only how much might be built and its affordability, but the quality of it as well. And I think I'll go through that as I go through this intro. 50% of homes are being built by the biggest 10 house builders. This is extraordinary. It doesn't happen in any OECD country. The top 25, the 25% are built by the top 3 companies. They absolutely dominate the market, and it's quite strange. Quite an anomaly. Asking them to build more homes doesn't make sense because it's not in their business model, and that's fine. That's fine. Their business model preserves their profit margins, and they're answerable to their shareholders. So I don't think we should expect more, but I think we should start crowding them out of the market. I mean, I hope they're not in the room. I don't expect they are. But we need to incentivize the land market so that there are more players involved, and that includes land trusts. It includes SME developers and builders. It includes self-builders and custom builders, and things like Bauer Group, which is popular and successful model of realizing housing in places like Germany and Austria and Argentina, which is where potential homeowners band together and then they buy land collectively and develop it themselves. It means they're not just building houses, but they're building kind of small and medium-sized apartment blocks, which seems fantastic. If you have local people building, they often act with more care in local places, and they can meet the granular needs of local people a lot better as well. And so instead of offering a kind of common denominator product into the market, we've all seen the 1 and 2 bed apartments that the volume house builders do, because they all look the same, and households are diversifying. So really, that's the second point. We need to diversify the product. And I think it is linked to the first point, because I think if more players are in the market with different business models, working more locally, more in tune with local needs, then you do come up with different solutions and different apartments and home types. And that is right as our society changes. Not everyone lives in a 1 and 2 bed apartment, and it's not totally suitable to their needs. So yes, to build to rent and co-living and co-housing and pocket homes. I mean, there are pros and cons to all of these, but I think my overall point is that there just needs to be more types, more stuff out there. The third point I want to say is that we can build up quality, and I think this points to the I guess the nub of the debate is pitting the delivery of housing on one side to does that need to sacrifice the environment? And at one level, like all building, even refurbishment work is carbon intensive. So there's kind of a philosophical argument about whether we should be doing anything at all. I think we should be building, and as long as we're doing it within planetary limits. But I know there's some people who think the opposite. I think the other aspect is, where and do we sacrifice greenbelt land in order to realize that the housing? I'm kind of going to sidestep that one because I've got another point to make. But I think every place is different, and every bit of green belt is a little bit different as well. I think it has a lot to do with access to infrastructure and the cost to bring forward land. But maybe we'll pick that up in questions. But the point I did want to make is that we can build to quality. And when we talk about sacrificing the environment, we can build environments that are really good and that are environments that contribute positively to biodiversity, and that actually increase the biodiversity on sites. We can build to lower carbon. We can build to create healthy and well-being neighborhoods that encourage health and well-being and foster community. These things should happen. If they did more regularly and often, then people wouldn't vilify developers. But unfortunately, there are a lot of bad developers out there. Let's talk about the good developers and encourage them to do more of the good stuff, and then people will be saying, yes, in my backyard. And so as a final point, I'm also going to say that the planning system is probably not the biggest problem, but let's pick it up in questions.
So slight shift. I've just got some pictures of some projects. So I work for a kind of community housing enabling organisation called Wessex Community Assets. And I'm also a researcher at the University of Plymouth, but very part-time. I thought I'd start with this quote from Hill and Mazzucato, which I think is quite apposite for tonight. for the benefit of my colleagues, innovative directions for building housing can be glimpsed within the rich diversity of experimentation at the edges of public, social and citizen-led housing. So I'm just going to give 5 very quick examples of some work that we've been involved with colleagues down in the southwest. Just a little bit of background. We've been going for about, well, over 20 years, supporting community land trusts across Devon, Dorset and Somerset. These are some of our houses that we've been involved with, and that's the kind of spread that we've been working across in the southwest. But about 5 years ago, we got increasingly frustrated. Quite a lot of the projects, and we perhaps can talk about this in the discussion, had to be done as partnership projects with housing associations. A lot of that's to do with regulation from government, Homes England funding, etc., and needs to be looked at. But we were very frustrated with A, the materials that were being used, and B, the fact that the builders who were building the houses were generally not local because of the contracting arrangements that were in place. So we started asking, well, what would we need to do to link local processing, construction to affordable housing, and how can we link all of that to local materials? So I live in Bridport in West Dorset, and one of the interesting things about Bridport is we have this heritage of rope and net making, which was traditionally made from hemp and flax. And so over the last 4 years, we've been working with local farmers, reintroducing hemp, and then the last year reintroducing flax as break crops within rotations with local farmers. And hemp is a really interesting, I could spend 5 minutes on hemp, but I won't. Anyway, we managed to get some funding, some Research Council funding with the University of Plymouth to start experimenting. And our particular focus was, how do you link local natural materials with modern methods of construction? So in particular, digital fabrication. So these were some panels that we made, prefabricated hemp panels that we made, the panels on a CNC machine. I'll come back to that. This is another interesting project in Bridport. It's the UK's largest affordable co-housing project. And we got involved, and also with another organisation I'm involved in, Dorset Community Energy, to look at whether it was possible to set up a microgrid for the co-housing. So every house has PV on the roof, and then there's a single inverter and also a large battery storage. Basically, over the last couple of years, the tenants have paid nothing for their electricity, which I'm not sure is an anomaly or whether that will carry on, but it's very good. They also saved £200,000 by not having a gas connection. So that was something we were involved in. And then through that, we then helped them in various ways with their common house. So a co-housing project has to have a common house. They basically ran out of money. Homes England won't fund common houses for co-housing projects, even if they're affordable housing projects. And so they had to raise the money themselves through a community share offer. And then the builders, they quoted 750,000 to build the common house. That was double what they had. And so with some colleagues, the common house was redesigned, and we basically came up with a solution that used local timber, local straw, and this is, not sure why it's done that up there, but anyway, we have working with one of our farmers, we have a big workshop where we were able to make the timber frames, do the straw insulation, and link that to training and volunteering, which was a kind of crucial part of the project. And then the other project that I'm going to refer to, we got inspiration from a really interesting organisation in Bristol called We Can Make. I'd really recommend you look at that. They've created a makerspace locally where they're training local people in digital fabrication, and then they're looking at one more minute. Yeah. They're looking at infill sites and back garden sites across Knoll West in Bristol. So we're working with a similar community housing group on a peripheral housing estate in Plymouth, and we've made a partnership with an organisation called Open Systems Lab that have developed this system called WikiHouse, And again, we want to create a local makerspace, a local community factory where we train local people in modern methods of construction, but we're also using natural materials for the build as well. And lastly, the last year we've had funding through the Community Energy Fund to look at the feasibility of a retrofit one-stop shop. And the house on the right here, the two houses on the right of the screen, the one on the left is an empty home which Dorset Council has just compulsory purchased. So we're currently in negotiation with them to take that on, which would then be the basis for a retrofit training programme for young people. And similarly, there's a larger building in Bridport owned by a housing association which has been empty for a long time, and we're in negotiation with them and also working with Assemble Studio, a very interesting architects, to refurbish it into accommodation. So I wanted to sort of add that thing about retrofit. I think community housing groups have had a major focus on construction, but actually there's a real opportunity to look at retrofit as well. That's my slides.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Becky, as you've heard. I want to introduce another tactic that we could use to try and solve this dilemma between meeting the housing needs of the population and trying to preserve the environment. So we've mostly been talking about building new homes, and of course there are big environmental costs there. But if you were to apply the saying, reduce, reuse, recycle to housing, what would that actually mean? So I think in addition to thinking about building new homes and retrofitting homes, we also need to think about making the best use of the homes we already have. And I've done some bits of research that shed some light on how this works. If you look at the housing development we've had in the past, it is extremely inefficient at solving the needs of the worst housed. So I looked at the whole of the 20th century, and there was a huge amount of work done by people like you, all kinds of organisations, private and public, vast amounts of money spent, vast amounts of land used. In 1911, the average household had 1 room per person. By 2011, they had 2 rooms per person, so massive change. But that's the average, and if you look at the worst off didn't get to that Edwardian average of having 1 room per person until 1991. So all that investment went in, and really the people at the bottom were neglected. So there's a warning. If you're going to try and build housing to solve the housing crisis, you need to really work hard and target it closely onto the people you're most concerned about. So that's the first point. Another thought is, what is the environmental impact of new housing? If you look at the last 20-ish years, from 2008 to 2022, there's actually been quite a revolution in the environmental efficiency of new housing, using the measures available. So if you look at the carbon production from heating homes, heating their water, lighting and ventilation, there's actually been a big fall from 2008 to 2022, despite the fact that the number of homes in total has gone up, because they've become so much more efficient at that. So at the beginning of that period, homes were producing 140 million tonnes of carbon dioxide for those functions per year. It's now down to 101 million in the UK, in England, which is, really exciting, fantastic and positive. Except there are a few buts that come along, because those aren't the only sources of carbon dioxide from homes. There's all the gadgets that we use, cooking, all kinds of other things. What about the construction that's already been mentioned, maintenance, demolition? What about other things in carbon dioxide production? So the land loss and the biodiversity loss. And over that period, England has lost 6% extra from its biodiversity abundance, according to the State of Nature report. So it's true, building homes is currently bad for the environment overall. So can we try and achieve both our housing goals and our environment goals in a different way? And my answer is that we need to make more use of the housing that we already have. And me and colleagues got together to think about this. We've had a long history of housing minimum standards, but should there be some other kind of concept of having enough housing and then maybe having more than enough? So just as a thought experiment, we considered
maybe we could count more than enough as having twice as much as the minimum standard space. So for a single person, that would be 80 square meters of housing each. That's the size of a fairly generous 2-bedroom flat for a 1-bedroom person, say. And if you count up around the country how much housing space could be considered more than enough, you know, while obviously some people don't have any housing space, others do have plenty. And 1/3 of households have more than enough space. And the amount of total space, if you look at that category, totally dwarfs what rough sleepers need, what homeless households need, what overcrowded people need. So there's actually 1,000 times as much more than enough space as rough sleepers need. Really enormous. 20 times as much more than enough space as an annual count of homeless households need. So I don't want to start suggesting that these kind of conceptual more than enough lines become legal maxima and everybody's forced to move home. But I think we need to devote at least as much time and energy to thinking about making better use of our homes as we do to thinking about building and retrofitting, because some of the answers are there. And although some people love their space, I mean, most people love their space, there are lots of people who would consider moving to a smaller place or taking a lodger or dividing their home if there was the help available, if it was made easier, if there were the right homes for them. So I think this is an area we just need to explore more. And gentle nudging in the taxation policy and local government policy and assistance and help from a new third sector on this issue would be fantastic. And it would help solve some of our housing goals while meeting some of our climate goals more quickly than just using the two main strategies we have at the moment of building and retrofitting. And some of the things you could think that, my last minute, I think we need to think about yet another task for local government, which would be helping people who want to downsize. Local authorities know their markets. Maybe it's something community land trusts could get involved with. Helping people to divide their homes, to make use of spare rooms, maybe to release equity as well and live better overall, or to share their homes with lodgers and others. And government could do more. One thing I'm quite shocked about is there's no standard statistical measure of the CO2 costs of building, maintaining, improving and demolishing homes. And we need that data to really understand the impact of what's going on in the building industry. And we need regular data on that. And I think government and developers could, as well as focusing new building on affordable homes, which I'm sure we'll all agree with, should also make sure to include homes for downsizers to move into. Thank you.
We're going to open the discussion to the floor for questions, please. So if you just want to raise your hands, I'll take them one at a time for now, and then we'll see if we go. So if we start here, and then the gentleman in the grey top.
Hello, I'm Sue Roberts from Bioabundance Community Interest Company, and we were set up in 2020 in order to take the Secretary of State to court because he insisted that in South Oxfordshire we must build 3 to 4 times more homes than our growing population could fill. So 2 empty homes for 1 home that could be filled, on the basis that would create growth. The reason we object to it so much is entirely for environmental reasons. And one of the things that people think about when they think about lost land is, with the intentions for building that might go forth according to the land use framework, only 1% more English land would go to housing by 2050, I think. But it's not the actual coverage of land, it's what it does to nature and interrupting the sways of land. Every time you build a house and a road to that house, you're interrupting a place where previously animals and plants would flow across. And you're creating these little islands, and eventually they die out. And it is nature that perhaps will get us before climate does, the destruction of nature, because we cannot survive without nature. That's the one thing. The other thing about housing is the
Is there a question?
construction build, which we read from Taylor Wimpey, is 250 tonnes per house. So, which, to put it into perspective, it takes 12,500 trees a year to absorb 250 tonnes from a single house. So I really loved your point, Becky. It's our point as well that that the houses that exist should be filled first. So what do we think about making it illegal to buy a home if you're not going to use it for residential purposes, if it's being used as an asset, and if it's not being held by someone who lives in the vicinity, maybe as a landlord or maybe as a resident?
My personal view is that since we haven't tried very hard on making the best use of our existing homes, the first thing to do is not to legislate and to compel people to do things. First of all, it's to experiment and encourage.
I feel like I'm going to be unpopular, whatever I say here. I think I'm not maybe going to get into the weeds of that, but I would say that my position, and I would hope kind of most people's position, is that housing is a human right and it should never be used as a vehicle from which any individual can profit.
Just another thought. Darryl, you raised the point about the limited number of major builders. I think it's partly because of the strange structure of our building industry in this country that governments have felt compelled to produce these from on high numbers, because they're powerless in the face of a market that doesn't seem to be working. And of course then that creates knock-on problems in particular areas as you've described. But it may be a symptom of a different problem, really.
Okay, so one question here. Yes, mine at the very top. Yes, you. Yes.
Thank you, everybody, in the panel. I'm Daniel Sharp, otherwise known as Dan the Plan, so you can guess what profession I have followed and still follow. I'm going to introduce you to a new topic. It's called custom splitting. So the Housing and Planning Act 2015 said every council has to keep a statutory register of those people who want to build their own house in that district. It didn't work, and only a year later they said, and the amendment to the Act, they have to provide sufficient service plots to meet that demand. It is completely abused by not being used. It underestimates the number of people who want to do it. And my suggestion is that they should also keep a non-statutory register of those people who are prepared to split a house. So you don't wait forever, ever, for a service plot. You have a register of people who with space that they're prepared to share, and a register of those people who would build, but would be quite happy to split my house with me. So that is called custom splitting. We have adequate space. We have no incentives to do it. I think in many cases you wouldn't get sufficient value out of the two houses that you currently have in the one. But I have half a house that I'd be very willing to share with the right person who could walk my dog for me, and then perhaps even care for me in my dotage. So that is my solution. I would also say, because we don't want to change everything, we have a national planning policy framework. There are two incredibly important phrases in that. One is a presumption in favour of sustainable development. It lasted less than 6 months from when it was published in 2012, but any honest judge would know that sustainable development means a planning policy based on what you have been suggesting. And the other term, which bases what Becky mentioned, is sufficiency. It actually says you have to provide sufficient housing. Well, if you calculate that, you have to take into account the level of under-occupancy. And only one council has tried it and failed. That's Tamworth and Letchworth. It won't take long before other councils do a better job of measuring sufficiency and use it in the planning process. Sorry, there wasn't a question there, Deborah, sorry.
No, it's fascinating. When you have an audience who are pretty much as well informed on this subject as the panelists, you actually really need a round table, don't you? And I'm minded to make sure you keep your so-called questions to a minute, and I'll start being strict. The man here in the front.
Thank you. Colin Tudge, and I run a website called The Great Rethink. And I just wondered if the panelists, would you feel deep down that we really can solve the world's problems or these problems without thinking very deeply, for example, about the whole business of land ownership? Can we really do it unless we rethink along the lines, for example, of Henry George? Can we really solve the problems economically within the context of a market economy, neoliberal economy? Can we really come to grips with wildlife, the question you asked more or less, if we take an anthropocentric attitude to nature, if we think that nature is a resource, if we go on thinking along these lines, can we really hope to solve all these problems?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can make things better. And I mean, personally, I'm not a revolutionary. And, you know, maybe that, you know, there's a criticism in that, but you know, that's my personal politics. I think land, it does come down to land and land ownership. I think within my market-based, non-revolutionary framework, I'm thinking about land value capture mechanisms, which have always been difficult to implement. One, because the politics, and that's one thing, but two, because it's that the mechanisms get very difficult to calculate, you know, what something is worth, when, to whom. But I don't think that should be insurmountable, and there should be more people working on it. But I do think the political issue is a big one that does kind of stop a lot of progress on that. And it should be that Henry George tried to do it in the Liberals. He lost his, I mean, they lost power over something like that, didn't they? And it's swung over time. There have been numerous administrations, both Labour, Liberal, and Tory, that have tried to introduce land value and land taxes over the last century, and all have failed.
Yeah, I guess in this context, it's worth mentioning the garden cities, because I think places like Letchworth, I think they did kind of deal with this question of how we... Oh, sorry. Thought it was empty. Luckily, it's hot, so yeah. So Letchworth Garden City is really interesting because they did manage to capture the uplift in land value and use that to deal with the sort of infrastructure in the town. And it fell down in, I think, 1967 when the Labour government introduced leasehold enfranchisement, because then the leaseholders could convert to freehold and sort of capture that value. And when community land trusts were introduced into this country in around 2000 by the New Economics Foundation, the proposal was that you would need to put you'd have a community land trust holding the land, but the individuals would have to be in a cooperative, a mutual home ownership society, and that way they couldn't exercise, you know, leasehold enfranchisement. And it's been a real struggle to get mutual home ownership off the ground, but it's starting. In York, for example, there's a really interesting project. So I think that's one kind of real example. And I guess the other question then is whether Labour's sort of toying with the idea of garden cities, whether they could be done in a way that matches the sort of aspiration of Letchworth Garden City.
I mean, I was just going to say, like, I mean, there's not much that's ethical under capitalism, is there? I mean, in terms of the question of like, you know, you referenced neoliberalism and kind of look at what Thatcher did to house. It was a deliberate attack on housing. It turned it into a commodity, right? And unless we shift how we understand and see that, then, you know, I guess there are policies that we can do, but are they tinkering around the edges? Perhaps. Is that what we should be doing? Yes, now. You know, speculation of land in cities is a massive problem. I look around the city that I live in and love and my family are from, and most of it's empty because massive corporations have been sitting on land and banking it for years, for decades. And if it's not empty, you know, a grade 2 listed building goes on fire quite regularly. And we all know why that happens. So I think there are things that can do, whether or not they're tinkering. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do them, but yeah, I would say ownership is key always.
Okay, so here.
Hi all, sorry, not sure if you can see me. Thank you so much, very fascinating insights. And I've missed the first speaker, so apologies if this question, if this is already covered. But this is in relation to even though I agree with everything that Debbie, what you were saying about retrofitting and really the importance of using the existing stock, that should be the priority. But I wanted to touch upon the New Towns program that the government has been leading and the new task force that was established and looking into this, because one of the kind of examples the government is using as the good example of placemaking for these new towns is the post-war town program that they're saying is a great success. But of course, there's good things and bad things about that, and particularly from a sustainability point of view, because you've touched upon the materials that are using in housing now, and at the time they were supposedly the best ones, but actually the life cycle was much shorter, and a lot of the housing now either need to be demolished or there's various consequences because the materials that were used, a lot of carbon that went in now is not actually served its purpose as it should have been, but also social infrastructure with either lacking, and we just have housing rather than places where people or neighborhoods, communities, and in places that did provide public infrastructure, social infrastructure, there were not always relevant sinking funds or the maintenance pots that were needed to maintain it in the long run. So I think if we are building now, and that is happening, and local authorities are coming up with potential areas, how do we ensure that the new housing that we're now delivering is not just housing, but it's communities, it's neighborhoods, and it will serve for more than 20, 30, and 50 years, that it is fit for purpose from both real estate viewpoints, from financial viewpoints as well. If you can highlight or any thoughts on that, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
I mean, the comments about Letchworth Garden City were really, really pertinent, and I think, you know, with the new town, I mean, when I got excited about Labour bringing in the new towns project, because I thought, oh gosh, they're going to forward fund infrastructure and they didn't do land value capture. I'm not sure those two things are kind of front center. But they need to be those mechanisms, yeah, because otherwise you just get into a kind of a sort of a initially state subsidized system that marketizes and then just becomes normal without maintenance cost and all the rest of it.
I mean, just to follow up your previous comment about Baugruppen in Germany, and you see similar things in the Netherlands, for example, where the local authority will, basically, I mean, ideally purchase the land at agricultural value, i.e. at 10, 15,000 an acre rather than million or 2 million an acre. That's the biggest problem I see. And then, but in places like Germany, you see projects where the local authority will basically put in all the enabling infrastructure so that a group doesn't have to, community housing groups in this country, we have to deal with so many issues, from getting the land, getting the planning permission, et cetera, that's all dealt with under that Baugruppen system. So if this government had the imagination to think, actually, new towns could offer that, maybe learning something from Graven Hill, the good and the bad, that would be really good.
Okay.
Hi, yes. I'm Richard Harding. I don't know if I'm representing, I'll say I'm from CPRE Oxfordshire. I want to talk about housing density. I live down in Wallingford, and there's big developments going on there by Berkeley Homes. They're just one of the big 3 or 10, I'm not sure. They're building at 25 houses a hectare. Now, Jericho, Mayfair, and many other very desirable places are 80, 90, 100 houses per hectare. Very nice developments. How can we force or change the culture from these very extensive car-based developments? Because you spread out, if you have a high density development, you can put all the services in there, like transport, public transport, and shops, etc. These things are just deserts in terms of services because they're so spread out partly. And so can we force it through the local plans? Should we, through the planning system? Or can we change the culture of what is a desirable house? Or aspirational oh-no's, I suppose.
I mean, yes to both of those. I thought under the NPPF, used to be obliged to build at about 40 dwellings per hectare, so I'm not sure how they're getting away with less than that. A lot of density a lot of site planning allocates space for cars. If you take that away, then you can get either more dense development or you just get more green space. The norm for house builders and for home buyers that they've created the market for is that you park your car or two cars in front of your front door. We've proven in developments if you can just park down the road collectively in a little lot, then you can free up so much land for either more homes, kind of greater density because you're just walking people to their home front door, or to green space. So how you bring that out, I think has to be carrot and stick, so that it can be regulatory to oblige building at greater densities, but also kind of trying to. It'll probably take some pioneer developments to prove that the market is viable from a product and sales point of view. But I think that's why if there are more players in the market who have that kind of mentality, then you can start to turn around and create new markets for people who don't expect those same norms.
Just to add to that, I mentioned We Can Make, and they've been working with War Thistleton on a project called Multimax, which is about taking infill sites in Knoll West, this housing estate in Knoll West, and putting medium density 3-story housing into those spaces. And there's going to be a launch. They've got a really well documented sort of playbook, you have to use that term now, that's launching, I think, June the 16th in Bristol. If you look on Eventbrite, We Can Make are launching that. So I think that's one interesting example. And we're working with Assemble, who are looking at medium density sort of examples around Europe, of which there are many, many more. And then we're working with Bridport Town Council to say, let's identify sites around the town and see how these medium density houses could go in. And obviously the last thing I'd say is that on the edge of Bridport, we've got Barratt's building 760 houses. Most of them are 3 and 4 bedroom houses. The housing needs survey says we need 1 and 2 bedroom houses, but they make their money from low density 3 and 4 bedroom houses. So we do have a challenge there.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Miriam Mutiswa, board member with OCLT. Mine is a very short question. With all the great minds, the conversations that are taking place here and elsewhere, how do we get the haves, those that have the land, vast land that surrounds us, which is not in use, like in places like Oxfordshire, to come to the round table and influence local authorities, central government, to pass on that land, those assets, to people or groups like the OCLT. Thank you.
So the question was, how do we get the people with the land, the people that have, into this room to hear the solutions and do something about it?
I'll start it off. Brute force through planning policy, which is what happened in the north of Oxford with the claiming back of some green belt, or the redesignation of some green belt land to meet the housing needs of Oxford City. I'm sure you know about it. It's not necessarily the most popular way of doing it. Round table, yes.
This is totally not an answer to your question, which is annoying, but I'm going to say it anyway. This is not how we get the people with the land right now around the table, but one thing that we do need to start normalising in conversation that we've been trying to do a lot of work on is a total moratorium on sale of public land now, because there still is a lot, and that's not actually in the conversation. The government is still pushing local authorities to offset their land, brownfield, greenfield, whatever it is. So it's not an answer to that question, but it's just something on the land question that I do think is important for us to be talking about.
And we have to keep plugging away and saying that local authorities can compulsory purchase land on the edge of towns at agricultural value. That seems essential.
Okay, I'm going to take one more question. Bloke with the glasses at the back. And then it's beholden upon you to bring this to a close.
Well, I'd just like to thank you for mentioning lodgers earlier on, the lady in the phone dress and the chap in front of me in the grey shirt as well. I happen to be lucky enough to live in a 4-bedroom house along the Cowley Road. I can, according to the Housing Act 2004, Schedule 14, Section 6, says buildings occupied by owners don't need to be HMOs, provided they have no more than such number of other persons as is specified for the purposes of this paragraph in regulations made by the appropriate national authority. Now, I don't know whether Oxford count as a national authority, but I've had 2 lodgers for a number of years, and in fact, for about the first 20 years I lived in the house, I had 3. I've now been told that I could have a wife and 5 kids, maybe a girlfriend and 5 stepchildren, chef, chauffeur, gardener, au pair, 2 lodgers, as long as I don't charge the others rent. But if I go from 2 lodgers to 3 lodgers, £30,000 fine. So I just want to make that clear, because I think we're right, we should be able to have more lodgers. A few years ago, they put up the rent-a-room relief from 4,250 to 7.5 grand. I wrote to the Treasury about 2 years ago and said, why don't you put up to 15 grand? If everyone takes in 2 lodgers, no tax to pay, that will solve the housing crisis, at least in Oxford. I think that's one way forward. They didn't. They simply wrote back and said, we don't need to worry about this at the moment.
I'd just like to say that sounds a really positive idea, and one example of how by knowing the law and working on the law and policy, we can probably get more out of our housing system and better situation from everybody. Thank you.
Okay. It'd be nice to take one more question. The woman at the back.
Thank you.
Yes, actually, thank you for the wonderful question about density and that I wanted to raise as well. My question actually was related maybe to your research, Professor Tunstall, given maybe as a kind of entry, and also to the question of retrofitting. I mean, it's quite surprising to observe that the EPC rating that kind of value the structure and its potential to keep the heat isn't done per capita, so there is no relationship. If we were looking at use of resource per capita, I think it would change the balance. That's a question.
Okay, that's a really good point. I was involved in a project some years ago looking at the development of eco homes by the Joseph Rowntree Trust outside York. Absolutely fantastic homes, very popular. Good energy efficiency, but 4-bedroom homes ended up being lived in by 1 person. So that's a lot of energy per person. Yeah, we need to think carefully about our measures. Sometimes it's per person that counts. Sometimes it's just the overall total for the whole nation, because that's what the planet is noticing. Thank you.
Goodness me. Thank you, everyone. I mean, thank you, panel. First of all, let's have a round of applause. That's kind of setting the ball rolling. The frustrating, so I think I'm going to sum up now, aren't I, Josh? And I'm not going to, because I do not know where to start. But, well, no, solving it is really easy. We could do it if we ruled the world in 30 seconds. Yes, the issues are complex and they're nuanced, but it isn't that difficult. And it breaks my heart. I got involved in local politics 30 years ago in this city, and we're still talking now about the same problems we talked about then, and climate change wasn't even a thing back then. So I take your point around slow and steady and trying to bring people along, but I think I am a revolutionary at heart, and there's such a huge power between these very thoughtful, able to be achieved, were the political will there solutions, that I don't think it's going to take persuading people. I mean, I think we need to do that as well, but we need more revolution, because it ain't going to happen. And the problem is, 30 years ago, if we were doing all of this, great. But we're stuffed now, folks. It needs to happen now. And so that's what I want you to go away thinking about. How do we take these solutions? We don't need to invent anything. It's all in this room, and make them happen. Actually, now's too late. Yesterday, so that we save the planet and house people. It should be a no-brainer. The last thing I have to say, apart from thank you, Kellogg College, can we please come back and do the next one, because I don't think we're finished, is Oxfordshire Community Land Trust are running a series of workshops inspired by Wessex Community Assets on building with natural materials that we might grow in the county from June the 24th to the 29th. We'd love you to sign up. There's more information about them on some of the boards. Sorry, where are we pointing? Oh, at the back. So please go and have a look. And one more round of applause, please, to everyone. Thank you.
And just before we wrap up, just a quick reminder that the next GCHU Public Seminar will take place in week 8 of Trinity Term on Wednesday, the 18th of June. And this session will focus on designing urban futures. Can communities prosper under net zero? So to explore how we define prosperity in the face of social inequalities and ecological crisis, and how urban planning might respond. So maybe a similar issue. So please do save the date. We'd love to see you there for another event in our seminar series. But for now, we invite you to join us at the back for drinks and nibbles and a chance to continue the conversation informally. So thanks again to our speakers and to all of you for coming. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.